Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at The Settlers 2, a real-time strategy, city-building, economic simulation kind of title, developed and published by Blue Byte Software in 1996 for the MS-DOS computer platform, with ports to Mac OS 1 year later, the Nintendo DS over 10 years later, and finally, the Amiga almost 30 years after its original release. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall. Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fose, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC Lewis W., Martin Steiner, Melody Octavia, James Nunn, Yuzu Soda, and Marek. Thanks to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into The Settlers 2, I thought it'd be a good idea to let everybody know why I chose The Settlers 2 for today's episode. And the fact is, I didn't. This is another sponsored episode. This one was sponsored by Caspian Zero. Caspian did send in a message to tell us all why he chose The Settlers 2 for today's episode. So Caspian, take it away.
The Settlers 2, what a game. I first found Classic Gaming Today looking for Monkey Island podcast episodes and I got hooked. Now, the Settlers series is nowhere near as popular as Monkey Island, but Settlers 2 has been remade and has a string of sequels, so I figured there must be some other people out there interested in this game too. To my surprise, I couldn't find any podcast episodes of it anywhere, so who better to remedy the situation but the incomparable Tony. So my story? I grew up in a Nintendo console family, but in '95 my parents stretched the budget to get us a PC, introducing me to the world of LucasArts adventure games, first-person shooters, or Doom clones, as was the style of the time, strategy games like Command & Conquer, all of that good stuff. Now, the internet was obviously very slow back then, hard drives were small, and new games were only obtained for birthdays and Christmas. So a huge source of new gaming experience, and helping you try before you buy so you don't waste a whole birthday present, were shareware and demos. Now, the best place to get these in my corner of Down Under, CDs on gaming mags. July 1996's edition of PC Gamer had its standard CD Gamer curated disc on it, featuring demos like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, Toshinden, some Duke Nukem 3D screensavers, remember those? And a little game I never heard of, The Settlers 2. Now, as soon as I tried it, I was hooked. Although the demo map isn't actually in the final game, it's the equivalent of a very early level, and I can't tell you how many times I played this demo. Optimizing road efficiency, building a mighty army to destroy the enemy headquarters, watching hundreds of little enemy settlers spill out and wander aimlessly before turning into skeletons. I would play on even after all the enemies were dead, just to pointlessly build an agrarian powerhouse economy. It was just that much fun to me. Obviously, I got the full game for my next birthday and the expansion pack, and I've subsequently picked up the Gold Edition and the 10th Anniversary Remake. There's just something about the colourful graphics and animation, the music and sound effects that are seared into my brain, the gameplay loop that always calls me back every now and again. This game just has a certain charm to it, and I love it. Now, I will note I didn't pick this game hoping Tony would love it too. I just wanted to really hear a new player's honest opinion of it. To be frank, I'm not even sure he'll like it. It's out of his usual area of interest. I can see how some might find the gameplay repetitive after a certain point. The combat is a huge weak point, and mechanics like the gold coin distribution is just a real headache. I could see it slipping into mediocre mentions if I'm being honest, but personally I'll keep my nostalgia goggles firmly on, and Settlers 2 is undeniably a Pantheon game to me.
Thank you, Caspian, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. Now, I was curious about The Settlers 2 once I heard about it, because I honestly didn't have much knowledge about it at all. But once Caspian introduced me to the game, I was definitely curious about it. As you all know, I have had a little bit of a roller coaster ride when it comes to real-time strategy games. Sometimes I play a real-time strategy game and I kind of click with it and I enjoy the overall experience from beginning to end. Other times, and I would say probably the majority of the time, I play a real-time strategy game and my strategies don't line up with the strategies that are needed in order to actually beat the game or to be successful in the game. I enjoy real-time strategy titles. It's just that I'm a little bit more of a casual real-time strategy gamer as opposed to somebody who seeks out real-time strategy games whenever they have a chance. I've played plenty of real-time strategy games, but I would be lying if I said I naturally gravitated towards them. There are a number of other genres in gaming that I really gravitate towards, things like point-and-click adventure games. You all know I love point-and-click adventure games. I will play almost any point-and-click adventure game. That genre of gaming speaks to me. Real-time strategy titles I enjoy, but I have a little bit of a harder time getting fully engaged with real-time strategy games. Anyway, when The Settlers 2 was mentioned as a possible episode, I did start researching the game, and I saw that this wasn't a traditional real-time strategy title. This one is almost like a mix of real-time strategy, god management kind of game with an economics simulator. Now, I will admit, that sounds like it could either be really intriguing or potentially really boring, because economics is not the kind of topic that you automatically think, oh yeah, that would make a really intriguing computer game. I mean, economics can be fascinating. But given my own issues with finding real-time strategy titles that really click with me, I was curious whether the Settlers 2 combination of god strategy coupled with economic simulation would really appeal. I was really curious if this would be one of the games that would grip me, or if it would be another real-time strategy title that I'd ultimately enjoy, but needed to overcome some barrier to entry to really get into. That is the question that we're going to attempt to answer as we start diving deep into The Settlers 2. The Settlers 2 is a real-time strategy, city-building, economic simulation kind of title, developed and published by Blue Byte Software in 1996 for the MS-DOS computer platform, with ports to the Mac OS, Nintendo DS, and Amiga platforms following in later years. Before we can talk about The Settlers 2, we need to talk about the game's creators, Blue Byte Software, a Germany-based development studio who over the years would make a name for themselves with several well-respected, high-quality releases that gained a fairly sizable fan base, with their earlier years spent creating several long-lasting franchises that have survived to the present day, with their more modern work focused on simply being part of the juggernaut that is Ubisoft, who acquired Blue Byte back in 2001. While today's Blue Byte isn't even officially called Blue Byte anymore, other than being the official legal entity in front of Ubisoft's entire German contingent of game development studios, the reason the Blue Byte name has persisted at all is due to the fans the company originally captured and the games it originally released, back when it was an independently owned, innovation-focused game development studio. So, let's talk about Blue Byte. The company was founded back in 1988 by Thomas Hertzler and Lothar Schmidt. They were game developers who had previously worked at another company, Rainbow Arts, which was another German development studio. Now, Rainbow Arts was not terribly well known back in the 1980s, though it would, over time, work on several high-profile ports, like the Amiga version of Apple favorite Shufflepuck Cafe and the MS-DOS version of Earthworm Jim, as well as a number of original properties that, at least based on a quick glance, don't appear to have been all that well known amongst the broad game-playing population, or at least they weren't all that well known to me. Rainbow Arts ended up being purchased by another company in 1986, and a couple of years after that acquisition, Hertzler and Schmidt decided that they could potentially create their own game development studio to create the games they wanted to make and not simply be a cog in the machine of another development studio. That desire led to the creation of Blue Byte Software in 1988, and despite the fact that the company's creation was enabled by taking a loan from Hertzler's parents, and that the company's offices would be based in Hertzler's own attic as opposed to an actual dedicated office space, Hertzler and Schmidt both had high hopes for the future titles that they could now be creating. The only question was, what games should they now begin creating? This is actually a fairly common thought process when a new game development studio gets brought into the world. A lot of times you have a couple of developers, or sometimes even a single developer, that knows they want to create something. They want to create something unfettered by corporate bonds. And they know that they can bring something really popular and worthwhile to the masses. The only issue is typically finding out what they're actually going to work on, because a lot of times that initial effort might be constrained either by finances or just an overall ability to break into the market. Because even back in the 80s and early 90s, when the computer and video game industry was still newer than what it is today, it was tough to get some recognition within that overall market. Regardless, Blue Byte Software was going to move forward. They were going to try to do something. And actually, it didn't take all that long before they would settle upon their first game, which would end up being a tennis simulation title released in 1989 called Great Courts in Germany and France, otherwise known as Pro Tennis Tour in other international regions. Well, it turns out, Blue Byte Software would strike gold with their very first release. So let's talk about Great Courts. This has been declared by many as one of the best tennis simulation titles of the era in which it was released. Your goal within the game was to improve your overall world ranking, as well as compete in the major tennis Grand Slam events that were built into the game, those being Wimbledon, the French Open, the US Open, and the Australian Open, which for anybody who does follow tennis will recognize those are still the Grand Slam events in tennis today. The biggest claim to fame, though, with Great Courts was the attention to detail. A lot of other tennis titles around this time could not stake the claim as being a true tennis simulation. Great Courts, however, could. They had tennis courts with different kinds of surfaces. You might have a hard surface, you might have grass, you might have clay. It utilized the entire tennis rule set within each of the matches. You had a true tennis feel to the tennis matches that you were playing. And you could even train in between matches with automatic ball machines that would fire tennis balls at you that you would have to return. It was really designed to recreate the feeling, to give you the feeling of being an actual tennis superstar. Now, that being said, the controls for the title could take some getting used to. As an example, you couldn't move while swinging your tennis racket. You needed to plant your feet before you could hit the ball. And aiming the ball could be challenging. But regardless, according to many, once you got used to the controls in the game, Great Courts provided the kind of tennis experience that had truly never been seen before on a home console or computer platform. The game even offered a 2-player mode for people to play against their friends and potentially enemies. Blue Byte's first game was a definite success, though as you might imagine, the market for tennis simulation titles wasn't all that expansive. It might have been a success, but it wasn't a blockbuster. Over the next couple years, Blue Byte would try to recapture the magic of their first release with limited success. It wasn't that Blue Byte lacked talent, it was simply that they hadn't yet found the game or genre that would let them display that talent to the broader game-playing population. That would all change in 1991, which is when Blue Byte would end up releasing the turn-based strategy title Battle Isle. Back in the early 90s and late 80s, strategy games on computer games, or strategy games for the home computer, were a little bit different than what they would become over the years, especially after companies like Westwood Studios would begin creating real-time strategy titles that really amped up the overall action and pace of gameplay. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, most of the time when you talked about a strategy game on a computer, you were talking about a digital representation of what could have been an actual strategy board game. The board gaming market, and in particular the wargame strategy board gaming market, was huge back in the 80s. Companies like Avalon Hill, their primary focus was to create deep and engrossing board games for interested strategy gamers to play and enjoy. Before strategy games became pervasive across the computer game industry, Avalon Hill and other company board games were pretty much the way to experience an intense and strategic gaming experience in the comfort of your living room. The board game industry had been popular, but as the late 80s approached, the opportunity that digital games had to compete with and potentially take over the previously analog strategic board gaming market began to rear its head. We would start to see around this time digital representations of previously analog tabletop strategy games, and Battle Isle would be a prime example of a digital incarnation of what would otherwise be a turn-based board game experience. The game would feature a hexagonal grid similar to many strategy board games of the time, and your goal was to take control of whatever map you might be on by beating your opponents, whether that's by eliminating all enemy units or capturing the enemy headquarters. The game was presented as a vertical split-screen kind of affair, where the left side is your player character and the right side is your opponent. Each round, you begin at your own headquarters surrounded by a number of different units, like planes, tanks, and infantry. And your opponent and you will both start at different sections of the map. Then, you have to find your opponents by exploring your surroundings. Now, there are two phases to gameplay within Battle Isle. There's the movement phase and the action phase. The movement phase, as you might expect, allowed you to move units to various positions in the game world. Each of your units could move a different number of spaces, and you could only move a certain amount for your specific turn. Now, assuming your pieces overlapped an opponent's unit, so assuming your units would overlap an opponent's unit at some place within the overall turn that you just took, you would effectively be declaring yourself ready for battle, which would then play out in the action gameplay phase, which you can really think of as the combat phase of the overall experience. Any units that might be overlapping at the end of a round will automatically initiate battle. Now, these battles play out without any additional player intervention. And, as you might expect, certain units will be more powerful than others. If all of the units taking part in a battle were equally powerful, victory would be mostly reserved for the luckier player, as well as the person who has more units available. Assuming you eliminate all units on a given space on the hex game grid, that spot will then become uninhabited, and you'll have defeated that particular set of enemy units. You would then continue to repeat that general process until you defeated all your enemy units or captured your opponent's headquarters, which would effectively win you the game. Battle Isle would feature 32 different scenarios for players to play through, as well as a 2-player mode, and it would release on the Amiga and MS-DOS computer platforms in 1991, and quickly become a hit. A huge number of publications declared the game to be absolutely amazing, stating that this game, Battle Isle, redefined the turn-based wargaming genre on a computer. It truly captured the feel of strategic board games, but with all of the amenities that running the game on a computer could provide, like graphics, music, and no need to really manage a bunch of miniature real-world units because the computer would do that for you. If you were a strategy gamer, and especially if you liked science fiction-based strategic warfare, Battle Isle was tough to beat. With Battle Isle becoming such a success, it stands to reason that Blue Byte would attempt to recapture that magic again with their next release, with the only question being, what would the company focus on now? They had delivered a worthwhile tennis simulation title. They had delivered an intriguing strategic gaming experience with Battle Isle. And because of the immediate success of Battle Isle, there was a lot of support within the company to continue building additional strategy-focused games, which Blue Byte felt could be a potentially lucrative direction that could help the company make an even greater name for themselves, assuming they were able to deliver another well-respected and enjoyable gaming experience with their next title. But they didn't want to simply iterate on Battle Isle with their next game. Sure, they wanted to stay in the overarching strategy arena, but recreating another digital board game-like experience, that really didn't appeal to the team at all. It truly wasn't clear what Blue Byte's next title was going to be until game designer and programmer Volker Vertic came up with an idea that he thought had some merit. Vertic had been a fan of a specific type of strategy title, the God Management Simulation, for lack of a better phrase. These games, rather than providing direct control over your units and allowing you to directly influence the outcome of a game, would instead put players in the role of an omnipotent and hopefully benevolent god, who could oversee their burgeoning civilization and influence their followers' daily lives, but wouldn't necessarily be able to directly interact with any single follower. Games like Populous, SimCity, and eventual influence on The Sims, Little Computer People, would give gamers indirect control over a large population of individuals, with each player's actions determining whether their followers, civilization, or city denizens would live peaceful and prosperous lives. Vertic had enjoyed playing these and other god management titles in the past, and he considered that perhaps he could create a similar kind of experience for Blue Byte's next game. So Vertic sat down and began prototyping this new game for the company. He spent a couple months working on the overall concept, after which he took a step back and looked at the work he had completed thus far and decided this just wasn't hitting the mark. It's not like his efforts were ill-conceived, it's just that the initial structure of the game he was beginning to create was largely derivative, and wasn't nearly innovative enough to make a splash with the broader gaming community. Luckily, Vertic hadn't spent too much time on his game before he decided that a change was in order. The only question was, what would that change end up being? Vertic didn't want to create a copycat of existing god management titles. He wanted to do something unique, and as he began to think about how to distinguish his game from the various other titles that other companies had already released, he had an epiphany. What if Vertic could combine the general structure of the god management genre with a concept that most games simply took for granted, that being economic simulation? Vertic envisioned a game where players would have control over a large population of people, similar to other god games, but rather than simply be interested in world conquest, your goal in this game would be to develop a functioning, if not optimal, economics-driven society, where the concepts of supply and demand would influence nearly every action and interaction gamers would see play out on their screens. Vertic considered that if he could pull off this admittedly unique combination of mechanics, then Blue Byte might have another hit on their hands. There was just one concern. Vertic didn't know how the heck he was going to make economics, a topic that many college students actively avoid taking as part of their coursework, an interesting and intriguing part of a game that was intended to, hopefully, be fun. Vertic didn't think making economics enjoyable would be impossible, but he did realize that it was going to take a lot of work. So Vertic began developing the game in earnest, spending the better part of 2 years simply creating the economics simulation that would make up the foundation of the game. Now, from the outside looking in, you might assume that spending 2 years coding an economics simulator might sound excessive, but consider that being able to have artificial intelligence routines respond to an ever-changing set of supply and demand conditions is a surprisingly difficult task, especially when the computer itself is handling a good chunk of the actions happening on the screen, because, like we talked about, this was intended to be a god management game, which means players might give general direction to their followers, but otherwise, the citizenry making up the in-game world would have to be able to execute their own tasks autonomously, and without a significant performance hit given computer performance of the time. The project's manager, Stefan Piasecki, provided an example of the complexity at play in a prior interview, in which he states, and I quote, "If there's a windmill next to a farmer, the program has to check whether that miller has the capacity to grind his corn. If not, the corn must be taken to another mill. But what if the street is crowded? The computer then has to work out the best route for the farmer to take his goods. Everything the human player doesn't do, the computer has to do. The people do their daily work on their own as long as the player doesn't give them orders. Essentially, you have to create a computer player to aid the human player, and then you have to create a powerful computer opponent to play against. It's a lot of work for the computer, as it has to manage all its little people and take military and economic considerations into account as well. As the game runs in real time, it can't slow down when a lot of things happen on screen at once." End quote. Obviously, creating this kind of economic simulation while making a game that would hopefully be enjoyable to play would end up being a lot of work. But luckily for all involved, the efforts of Piasecki, Vertich, and others would be rewarded with the eventual release of this brand new Blue Byte title, a game called The Settlers in 1993. The only question was, would all of that effort end up being worth it? The short answer to that question is yes it would, as The Settlers would become incredibly popular shortly after its release, and would garner significant critical praise and commercial success, with many publications calling The Settlers a masterpiece while praising the game's design, technical wizardry, and artificial intelligence systems, validating the long hours that Vertich and the team spent making this unique and ultimately engaging game. Further validating that effort was the fact that the game would receive multiple Game of the Year nominations and awards, and would, from a commercial perspective, sell well over 400,000 copies in the years following its release, while being recognized by many as one of the best Amiga titles ever released. The Settlers, in all respects, was a major success for Blue Byte. Interestingly, even before The Settlers was released, Blue Byte was banking on the game becoming a franchise. They just didn't want to pull the trigger on that decision until the game would prove itself to be commercially viable. Well, with several 100,000 copies sold, that viability was no longer in question. So, shortly after the release of The Settlers, work on a sequel would be greenlit, which would eventually result in the creation of our game of the day, The Settlers 2. As work on The Settlers 2 got underway, the team knew that they wanted to create an experience that exceeded the original in every conceivable way, from the level of complexity of the economic simulation, to the graphics on display, to the way the game's narrative would unfold across a connected campaign as opposed to disparate standalone missions. In a move that might be considered a bit of a shock though, the original game designer and developer from The Settlers, Volker Vertich, didn't want anything to do with the sequel. Now, that's not because he harbored some deep-seated resentment for his original creation. No, the simple fact is, after spending several years programming the daily lives, interactions, and simulations for thousands of in-game computer people, Vertich was ready for a break. And honestly, I cannot fault him for that decision. The good news, though, is that Blue Byte had a pretty talented team, and while Vertich wouldn't work on The Settlers 2, another member of the original Settlers team, Thomas Hauser, would get the opportunity to be the lead on the project. Hauser had joined the Blue Byte team as a tester for the original Settlers, and during his time playtesting the game, he came across a number of features that he thought could be improved upon to make for an even better game. Unfortunately, most of that feedback ended up being unable to be implemented in time for The Settlers' eventual release, though the team kept all of those enhancement ideas safe, just in case they'd have the opportunity to create another game in the series. Well, Blue Byte leadership remembered Hauser's recommendations, and they believed that many of them had merit, which is why Hauser was selected to lead the development on The Settlers 2. He had already identified a number of ways the original game could have potentially been improved. Now, he'd have the opportunity to actually act on those recommendations, and hopefully make an even better game in the process. A team of 12 people would work for a couple of years to bring The Settlers 2 to life, until finally, in April of 1996, the game would release to the masses, this time as an MS-DOS title as opposed to an Amiga original, with a Mac OS version following a year later, and a Nintendo DS port following around a decade after The Settlers 2 initially hit store shelves. And most interestingly, an Amiga port of the title finally releasing in October of 2025, almost 30 years after the original game's release. While that release might be a little bit of a rarity considering the Amiga is not a modern computer platform, The Settlers 2, when it originally came out, would become as acclaimed as the original game in the series, with critics praising all of the improvements the game made over its predecessor, while countless individuals new to the series would be indoctrinated into The Settlers 2's unique blend of god management gameplay coupled with deeply complex economics simulation. The Settlers 2 would end up being even more commercially successful than The Settlers, with over 600,000 copies sold in the 2 years following its release, along with a number of industry awards coupled with being named to many publications' best games of all time lists. It turns out that Blue Byte had found a repeatable recipe for success, and The Settlers 2, more so than any title released by Blue Byte up to that point, proved just how talented this small development studio truly was. As you might imagine, with a hugely successful 2-game streak, Blue Byte wanted to capitalize on that success, which is what would lead to them turning The Settlers into a long-running and largely successful franchise, with 7 mainline games and several spin-off titles having been released at the point of this recording, and total sales of over 10 million copies over the entire series. While Blue Byte would find success with other games and franchises over the years, The Settlers was arguably their crown jewel, and The Settlers 2, even more than the original title, is really what put the series and the company on the map. While work on the Settlers series continues to this day, Blue Byte as a company has undergone several changes over the years, including being acquired by Ubisoft in 2001, undergoing a name change in 2017 to Ubisoft Blue Byte, and finally being turned into a purely legal entity in 2020, with several children companies associated with the umbrella company, but no real direct development staff of any kind. Despite the corporate changes and restructuring that has occurred over the years, Blue Byte's legacy remains, and nowhere is that more evident than in the continued success of the Settlers series, a collection of games that provided a truly unique and previously unseen experience to the masses, all the way from its first release in 1993. The Settlers 2 would improve upon the original in nearly every way, and in the eyes of many, remains one of the best real-time strategy titles ever created, even today. My question, though, as a more casual real-time strategy gamer, is would the Settlers 2's combination of real-time strategy and economic simulator capture my attention? Or would the Settlers 2 become yet another real-time strategy title that, while certainly a worthwhile experience, wouldn't fully click with me? We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play The Settlers 2 today versus when it was released almost 30 years ago. The Settlers 2 is, at its core, a real-time strategy game, though to simply label Settlers 2 as an RTS doesn't really tell the whole story. While it is true that the game plays out in real time, and it is true that everything you do in the game is pretty much 100% strategic, and it is true that the game contains all of the common real-time strategy staples of resource collection and management, combat with a variety of military units, a complex technology tree, and a full-scale campaign. The simple fact is that The Settlers 2 is unlike nearly any other real-time strategy game I've played. Because while you definitely play the game in real time, and you definitely exert control over your resources, settlements, and other units in the game world, the degree to which your exertion of control results in something happening that you actually want to happen is not entirely within your control. That probably sounds really strange and potentially confusing, so let's talk about what it feels like to play The Settlers 2, and in the process, we'll discuss why The Settlers 2 is so different than the traditional real-time strategy game. First though, a quick note. As I usually do whenever I play any game, I chose to focus on the single-player experience, and because The Settlers 2 includes a 10-mission campaign, I decided that game mode was going to be where I spent all of my time. The game also includes a free mode, so to speak, where you can create any number of game permutations, altering the victory conditions, the number of human and computer opponents, as well as the degree to which multiplayer is supported, all of which sounds like it would be interesting to experience, but ultimately was not an aspect of the game that I personally explored. So, all of my commentary on the game is going to be based on the single-player campaign, which, similar to other strategy titles, almost serves as a tutorial for individuals prior to diving into the deep end of multiplayer competition. To be fair, it's a very long, oftentimes challenging tutorial, but it is a tutorial nonetheless. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk about The Settlers 2. And to start, I'm going to go through the high-level gameplay loop that you'll encounter when you begin playing the game. When you first start up a round of Settlers 2, whether the campaign or a standalone free mode game, you'll most likely start with a singular headquarters located in the center of some sort of landmass, and not much else other than the resources that might be stored inside that headquarters building. You can think of your headquarters as the heart of your settlement, at least at the start of the game, as it serves as the warehouse within which all resources, including both military and resource-gathering-oriented units, are housed. And until you begin to expand a bit further with your eventual settlement, your headquarters will remain a key location from which all future buildings and resource-generating units will be forced to visit. Whether you're gathering materials from various natural features of a given map, like ore or tree logs, or you're synthesizing your raw resources into some other material, your headquarters stores it all, assuming you've connected a given building to that headquarters. Because the connection points between each of your settlement's buildings, whether military-centric, resource-gathering, material refinement, or otherwise, will form the foundation of your entire gameplay experience. And in fact, the roads you end up building will legitimately be the most important aspect of your entire settlement. Now, you might be wondering, how can roads become foundational to your entire gameplay experience? Roads in most strategic-oriented games are partially an afterthought, as many real-time strategy games don't require you to place roads at all, let alone focus so much on your roads that they become critical to your overall settlement's development. Think about a game like Age of Empires. You don't need to worry about making sure a quarry is attached to your town center. You simply need to create a quarry, assign a villager to that quarry, and then stuff happens, namely the mining of resources and the storage of those resources in your town center. Or let's say you need to refine the stones acquired at that quarry into some other processed material. In many games, you'd simply create the right building that refines stones, and then that refinement begins automatically, and you can trust that your stones and the eventual refined material will make their way to wherever they're needed without you needing to intervene. The Settlers 2 takes a very different approach, because rather than simply focusing on the continued sprawl of an ever-growing settlement, you need to worry about how you place various buildings in your settlement, as well as the interconnections and roadways that exist between those buildings, as well as your headquarters and eventually storehouses and harbors. In this way, Settlers 2 requires a different degree of strategic forethought to the expansion of your settlement, and incidentally, the level of depth here is absolutely massive. Let's break down how some early gameplay moments might play out. So this is what a typical game of Settlers 2 might start out like. First, you need to get the beginnings of your economy started, which will almost certainly mean acquiring a source of food, as well as a means to gather wood, which is foundational to nearly every subsequent building and action you're going to take in the game. Focusing on food first, you'll likely have several options. If you're near a large body of water, you might decide to create a couple of fisheries. If you're near a forested area, by contrast, you might want to place a hunter in the area, since forests typically have various animals hiding in and around trees. Later on, you'll also figure out additional ways to make some food, namely by using a baker to bake bread, but that's not going to come until later on. For now, just starting out, fish and wildlife are going to be your main way to produce food. Placing either a fishery or hunter will expose you to the way territory expansion and building placement works in The Settlers 2, which, like most aspects of the game, is just a little bit different than most real-time strategy titles. When you go to place a building, you'll notice that you'll see a variety of icons on your local map that dictate what kinds of buildings you can build where. While this might seem complex at first, it's actually fairly simple. A single small house on the map represents the smallest possible settlement size and is reserved for fairly simple, albeit critical, buildings, like the aforementioned fishery and hunter, as well as other basic resource gathering buildings like woodcutters and stonemasons, and even pseudo-resource generating buildings like foresters. Important to note, though, is that small buildings can be placed on any plot of land, but larger buildings can only be placed on plots of land that are at least as large as the building's requirements. Anyway, a slightly larger looking house that looks sort of like two smaller houses joined together represents a medium settlement size and is often reserved for resource refinement buildings like sawmills, breweries, bakeries, and mills. A castle icon represents the largest possible settlement size and is reserved for major buildings like fortresses and harbors, and potentially buildings that require some land around them, like farms, which require extensive land in order to fully optimize grain production. There are also a couple of other icons on the map, including a mining icon, which represents areas where you can potentially mine for resources like gold, coal, and iron, assuming that particular resource is able to be mined from that particular area. Because simply seeing a mining icon on the map doesn't mean you can just plop down any old mine and begin gathering resources. No, in the Settlers 2, different areas of land may have different resource densities, and the only way to learn what you might be able to mine from a given node is by sending out a geologist to survey the area and see what he can discover, which will then give you insight into what types of ores you can mine from a given location. There's also a flag icon, which will help you place nodes along roads, a concept we're going to talk about in a little bit. And finally, before we move on, I should note that harbors can only be placed in very specific areas of very specific campaign maps, with an anchor-like icon showing where those buildings can be placed. Anyway, those are the main icons you're going to see on your map as you begin placing various structures. And the trick is to optimize the placement of all of your different buildings in order to maximize your overall economy. There is a ton of complexity and depth here, which we're going to continue talking about throughout our discussion. But for now, just recognize that different buildings have different size requirements, and your map will have certain sections that support specific buildings being erected, while other locations of a given area might not support buildings of a certain size. So, going back to our starting out example, let's say you placed a couple of fisheries near a large body of water. Well, when you place a given building, it needs to be built before it can be used. And to be built, it needs to be connected via a roadway of some sort to your headquarters. Otherwise, there would be no way for a builder to make their way to your fishery's construction site. Assuming you do connect your fishery to your headquarters via a road, you'll quickly see a couple of builders be dispatched to your construction site to begin building your brand new fishery. Now, the situation that we just discussed of putting down a construction request for a given building, followed by building a road to connect that building to your headquarters, might sound super simple at the moment, especially from the perspective of someone just beginning to play the game. But in reality, the concept of roads and connecting buildings together and planning out the eventual expanse of your soon-to-be far-reaching empire is going to become so critically important that it is truly the most important aspect of playing the game. The reason roads are so important is tied to one aspect of the game that took a lot of getting used to, which is the fact that other than adjusting various sliders to help influence the behaviors of your citizens, you will have no control over your population to do anything, instead being forced to act as a benevolent god who has hopefully imbued your citizens with a degree of intelligence and free will to do the things they need to do to help your civilization thrive. In our simple example, building a road between your fishery and your headquarters will automatically signal to your builders that construction needs to begin, so they set off for the construction site without issue. But not only do you need builders to make their way to your construction site, but you also need to transport the goods needed to actually build that structure in the first place, which in our example is a stockpile of wood. So, let's say you constructed a single road between your fishery and your headquarters with just two main flagged areas, the fishery itself and your headquarters. That means you now have a single long road that needs to be traversed by your builders, as well as individuals bringing wood to your construction site, which in this case is going to be restricted to a single person, because the way roads work, you only have a single citizen working any singular road. What that means in practice is that by building a road the way that we just did, you're going to have one person carrying wood from your headquarters to the fishery and then having to go back to retrieve more wood from your headquarters before bringing that additional wood back to your fishery. A process that, as you might expect, isn't terribly efficient. The answer to this inefficiency, it turns out, lies in the various nodes you place along your roadways, which are denoted by flags along a road. You can think of each individual segment of a road, meaning an area denoted by 2 flag endpoints, as being a road in and of itself, which means you can have a person stationed at each of those segments, which the game will do for you automatically whenever road segments exist. In practice, that means that rather than having a single person carrying wood along a long singular road, you can now have multiple people working in concert to bring wood from one flag to the next, at which point the next person takes the wood and brings it to the next flag, while the previous person goes back to retrieve more wood, creating a pseudo-assembly line of helpers transporting goods to a given location. Creating nodes efficiently and ensuring that your roadways connect between buildings effectively will form the foundation of your entire economy, and I cannot overstate just how important it is to have as many nodes as possible in order to maximize your ability to transfer goods, materials, and resources from one area of your settlement to another. A well-designed set of roadways and flags connecting your various buildings is a necessity to building a sustainable economy, and if you mess this up, you will learn of your mistake pretty darn quickly. Because construction orders you've placed won't be filled, mines won't be mined, military buildings won't be occupied, and any number of other inefficiencies will occur, all because you messed up with your road placements. Anyway, returning back to our example, we're still at a point where all we've done is placed a single fishery and connected it to our headquarters, which is about the simplest thing you can do, but has so much complexity under the surface that will impact the rest of the game that it borders on insane. The Settlers 2 is incredibly complex and surprisingly deep, and you will need to learn all of its systems and eccentricities if you hope to be successful. So, at this point, we have our fishery built and connected to our headquarters, which means now we actually need a fisherman to go and inhabit that fishery to begin catching fish. This, as before, the game will do for you automatically, assuming you have a fisherman in your headquarters. If you don't have a fisherman, then hopefully you'll have a fishing rod available, which will be assigned to one of your random helpers in order to create a fisherman. If you have neither a fisherman or a fishing rod, well then, that fishery is going to be lying dormant for quite some time. This situation illustrates another major area of complexity in the game, which is the sheer number of dependencies that are prevalent throughout your entire economic and resource production chain. The example we just talked about, which is that in order to populate a fishery, you need a fisherman, and in order to have a fisherman, you need a fishing rod, is fairly simple. But the level of complexity quickly ramps up to the point that you will almost certainly need to either study the game's dependency chains like you're cramming for a test, or make your own resource dependency notes and flowcharts, which incidentally I ended up doing and laminating. Yes, you heard that right. The game had such an insane degree of complexity and dependency chaining that not only did I make my own resource spreadsheet to keep track of how each resource supported other aspects of my economy, but I also created flowcharts showing the flow of resources and dependent connections between resources and buildings, and then laminated those sheets to keep them pristine as I worked my way through the game and learned how to play the game effectively. Let me tell you, I have never laminated anything for a game before. This was a first for me, and something that admittedly proved to be insanely useful. Now, I'm not going to go through every dependency or requirement for maximizing your economy, because I could almost teach a college course focused exclusively on the Settlers 2 and its underlying complexity, but I will go through some examples. First, let's take a look at the concept of mining for resources, like, say, gold. Like I mentioned earlier, before you can mine for gold, you first need to make sure gold exists in a given mineable area, which means you need to send out a geologist to survey the land. Let's say, for the sake of our example, that your geologist finds gold. Awesome, step 1 done. Now you need to place a construction order for a gold mine, as well as connect that mine up to your headquarters, which will make builders head over to the mine and build it. So far, so good. Okay, now you need a miner available to actually work in the mine, which, just to illustrate the complexity factor at play here, let's say you don't have. In this case, if you don't have a miner, that means you need to have the appropriate mining tools available to have the game convert one of your general helpers into a miner. Once again, to make this situation a bit more complex, assume you do not have the prerequisite mining tools available. In that case, that means you have to build those tools. Now you might think to yourself, okay, simple enough, let's just do it. Only the reality is, it is anything but simple. To make mining tools, you have to do two things. Prioritize mining tools to be produced over other tools, and have a metalworks constructed and connected to your overall settlement. Here's the thing though. In order for the metalworks to function, it needs wood boards and iron. In order to make wood boards, you need to have a sawmill, which can create boards from logs. In order to have logs, you need to have a woodcutter working in a nearby forest. So okay, to summarize, to get the wood boards you need to have a woodcutter cutting down trees, logs getting transported to your sawmill, and your sawmill producing boards. Oh, and lest I forget, to actually build a sawmill or metalworks in the first place, you also need stone, which requires a stonemason working in a quarry to acquire. Okay, cool. Half of the equation done. Now all you need is iron. Well, that might be a bit complex too, because iron can only be refined at an iron smelter. That iron smelter requires both coal and iron ore to function, with iron ore coming from an iron mine and coal coming from a coal mine. And those resources require you to have the specific mine type, whether iron or coal, on your map in a location that has those resources actually available. And if you have those mines created, you need miners to work those mines. And to do that, you need food, because miners won't work for free. Food, like we talked about, can only be acquired from fisheries, hunters, or farms. And for the sake of argument, let's say you have no fisheries, and your hunters have exhausted the supply of animals available in your territory. In that case, you need to bake bread, which means you need a bakery. For the bakery to produce bread, you need both flour and water. Water can be acquired easily enough in that you just need to create a well on your land, but flour is a little bit trickier. Because flour is refined from grain, and to do that refinement, you need a mill, which takes in grain and creates flour. To gather grain, however, you need a farm, and you need to prioritize grain to be transported to your mill, as opposed to, say, your brewery, because making a bunch of beer is good for recruiting soldiers, not baking bread. Anyway, assuming you do all of that, you'll have fulfilled all of the dependencies needed to make a single mining pick. I know you might think that I'm exaggerating, but if you do find yourself in this worst case scenario kind of situation, this is legitimately the only way you'd be able to create another miner to work in your newly constructed gold mine. And don't forget, you'd need to feed him in order for him to actually mine gold from the mine. And once you get that gold, don't forget that you'd need to refine that gold into coins at a mint, which requires both unrefined gold and coal, which is now competing with your bakery for that singular resource. And once you generate those coins, you're going to have to figure out how to transport those coins to the right military buildings to upgrade your troops, because there is an efficient way to manage your troops and a wasteful way to manage them, and given the scarcity of resources on most maps, you do not want to be wasteful with anything in this game. Even further, everything we just discussed assumes you have a perfectly running and optimized network of roads and flags to transport all of these goods around your settlement, and further assumes you've spent some time prioritizing the transport of materials to the buildings that need them most, which you can do via a separate screen that basically gives the artificial intelligence some general direction with your preferences, and then lets them execute that direction as well as it possibly can. The issue is, just one less than optimized step in the process can make your production stutter to a halt, and until you become very familiar with the game's inner workings, you may begin to wonder why the thing you want to happen isn't happening. When this kind of thing happens, it can be very frustrating, because in many real-time strategy games, you can intervene yourself and set things in motion to course correct, oftentimes by micromanaging your resources to get them back on track. You cannot do that at all in the Settlers 2, as you have no direct control over your population, other than setting certain priorities on a variety of screens that will hopefully result in your helpers doing what you want them to do. Getting it just right is tricky, but when you do get your economy running smoothly, it's a pretty great feeling, I'm not gonna lie. It happens very rarely, especially in campaign missions, but it is possible. You just might need some time to figure out how things work before you become truly proficient at what the game expects from you. Anyway, up to this point, we've spoken only about the resource generating and gathering aspects of the game. But, like most real-time strategy games, there's also a need to both expand your settlement and potentially conquer some civilizations, which is where the military system comes into the game. Expansion beyond your original borders is driven solely by the creation of military buildings on your settlement's outskirts, which will expand the total borders of your land and allow you to settle in new areas of the map, and potentially access brand new resources that will help your growing civilization thrive. In much the same way as every other building in the game requires an inhabitant of the appropriate type to function, barracks and other military installations are no different, in that they require soldiers to actually expand your borders. Different military buildings can house different numbers of soldiers, and while soldiers are situated in your military buildings, you can upgrade them through several different ranks by transporting gold coins to those buildings. This upgrade system, while seemingly simple on the surface, actually hides some deeper complexity, and let me tell you, you will need to upgrade your military forces because your enemies are going to do the same, and the power differential between a fully upgraded soldier and a new recruit is dramatic. Upgrading troops is absolutely essential to continued expansion, as is managing your overall army, which, similar to our discussion on the dependencies needed to create a mining pick, have a series of interlocking and dependent requirements that all need to be met efficiently just to recruit a new low-level soldier. And you'll absolutely need to do some recruitment, because expanding your territory will almost certainly mean engaging in combat with enemy forces. Combat in The Settlers 2 is very similar to the rest of the game, in that you can define some preferences as far as how many soldiers might stay near your borders or further in towards the center of your settlement. You can define whether strong soldiers or weak soldiers are set to offense or defense, and you can generally control the rough magnitude of how many soldiers are available to be sent out to attack opposing forces. But beyond setting those preferences, everything about combat plays out without your direct control. You do tell your troops which enemy military installations to attack, but once you do that, the actual combat will come down to the overall ranks of each soldier taking part in the battle, as well as how many troops you have versus how many your enemy has. Other than that, you simply sit back and watch the battle play out, hopefully in your favor. Assuming you do win a battle, you'll take over the enemy's building, and you'll expand your territory even further, with any enemy buildings nearby being destroyed as your enemy loses land. You have to be careful though, because once you initiate a battle for the first time, it's effectively a declaration of war, and now the enemy has the option to attack you. And based on my own experiences, the enemy can be absolutely relentless at times. Because of the lack of direct control you have over your military, combat in The Settlers 2 can sometimes feel random, and in some situations preordained, which can be frustrating at times. Also frustrating is whenever you have to deal with enemy catapults, who can make short work of military buildings and effectively halt your progression unless you figure out a way to claim that piece of land before you fully expand into that territory. Of course, you can also use catapults to great effect too, but more times than not, you'll be attacking a fortified position, and with catapults at play, forward progress can be dramatically slowed down. Eventually, you will get the hang of the combat in the game, along with all of the interlocking systems that you need to balance, as well as the best way to expand and retain an optimized economy, which gets progressively more challenging and demanding the bigger your settlement becomes. Adding to this challenge is the fact that in the campaign mode, your overall goal is to find and capture a single magical gate on each map, and because you can't actually see any land beyond your borders, short of whatever your scouts might see with their limited sightlines, actually beating each campaign mission can take hours if you're not using a guide that gives you a sense of where you need to expand to. There were so many times that I expanded significantly in one direction of the map, only to find that my goal was somewhere else entirely. And in those instances, you may be stretched so thinly that the best path forward is to simply restart your mission. There may only be 10 campaign missions in the game, but each one takes hours to complete blind, and I would be lying if I suggested that there wasn't some frustration with how tricky it could be to find where you need to go on any given map. Adding to that frustration, and one of the biggest issues I had with the game, is the fact that the entire experience is so slow that at its default speed, the game will simply take forever to play out, and that's not an exaggeration. Because of how reliant you are on transporting goods, resources, and people from point A to point B, there is a significant amount of time waiting built into the core gameplay loop. And unless you modify the game's speed, you're going to be playing this thing for a ridiculous number of hours just to accomplish minor goals. Many people have claimed that because of this speed, The Settlers 2 is actually one of the more relaxing real-time strategy games ever made, though I have to take exception with that assertion. Just because everything moves slowly doesn't mean this is a relaxing experience, because the computer-controlled players will outplay you, and in actuality, it feels even worse when you lose to the computer after spending a bunch of slow hours playing a given mission than it does when you've sped things up to eliminate some of the tedium involved in the very slow-paced gameplay inherent in the game. Luckily, you can double the game speed by pressing the V key on your keyboard, which helps slightly. Even then, the game is so slow. Even luckier, though, is that there are cheats you can use to speed things up even more. If you type winter into the game, you can then use the Alt key plus a number between 1 and 6 to set the overall speed of the game, with 6 representing a 600% increase to the game's execution. Now, the game isn't built to support a 6 times increase to the game speed, so actually doing anything at that speed is nearly impossible. But what you can do is set up your economy, issue some construction orders, and then crank that speed up to eliminate a lot of the waiting that you'd otherwise need to experience, just to figure out if your strategy was sound or not in the first place. To note, I do not condone cheating. But in this case, I'll make an exception, simply because the only thing this cheat does is speed up your gameplay. It doesn't give you an unfair advantage in any way. It simply makes it so that you don't have time to write a novel while your builders construct a catapult on the outskirts of your settlement. Now, I know some of you right now might be thinking, Tony, my man, I can't believe you rushed through the game. That's not like you at all. Why didn't you sit back and savor the experience? To that, I'll simply say, you know nothing of what I experienced playing this game. I'm going to put things into perspective for you. At the point I completed all 10 campaign missions, I had spent around 45 hours playing the game. Of those hours, around 35 were spent accelerating the game at 6 times speed. How about we do the math? That means if I played the game at its default speed, I would have spent well over 200 hours making my way through the game's 10 campaign missions. I am a big believer in savoring and taking your time with any game I play. But come on, I'd argue that the speed up cheat actually improved my enjoyment of the game. Otherwise, this episode might have never released. Anyway, there's surprisingly a ton more to talk about. And when I said earlier that I could give a college lecture series about all of the different complexities of the game, I kind of meant it. The Settlers 2 is perhaps one of the most deep and complex experiences I've had with any game I've played for the podcast. And while we won't cover all of those complexities today, hopefully I provided enough of a description so that you all can understand just how complex the Settlers 2's design truly is. It's an incredibly impressive feat of design and programming that all of this complexity meshes together as well as it does, and I remain in awe of just how deep the core mechanics truly are. That doesn't mean there aren't flaws here, with the biggest one from my perspective being the general pace of gameplay, but undeniably, there is a lot of goodness here. We're going to talk even more about the various aspects of the game and ultimately my overall opinion of the title in just a little bit. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. Now, I should mention that I do not own the Settlers 2 in physical form, and I couldn't find the original Settlers 2 box anywhere. So I'm actually going to read the back of the Settlers 2 Gold Edition, which was a release of the game that included its expansion pack. So there was eventually an expansion pack for the Settlers 2. The Gold Edition was released as a combination of the original game plus that expansion pack. For all of the commentary I've made thus far and throughout this episode, we really did focus on just the real Settlers 2, meaning the original release. But for the purposes of the box, the only one I could find was the Gold Edition, so that's what we're going to do. So, for the Settlers 2 Gold Edition for the MS-DOS computer platform, the back of the box says, the Settlers 2 Gold Edition pack is the unique combination of both the original version of the Settlers 2 and the Settlers 2 Mission CD. The Settlers 2 Gold Edition is a highly detailed and humorous economic simulation. At the mercy of the elements, the shipwrecked Roman crew make their way into a seemingly deserted desert island. You must now lead these survivors on an ultimate quest: world domination. Food and building materials must be developed, for the productivity of future shipbuilders, foresters, brewers, and scouts depends on it. Construct gold, coal, iron, and granite mines. Cultivate the land, build farms, establish fisheries and hunting grounds. Build up your stocks of animals and manage forests. The well-being of your subjects rests in your hands. But don't be lulled into a false sense of security. Danger lurks everywhere. Prepare to defend your hard-won kingdom, for you are not alone. Watch out for the wild Vikings, hot-blooded Nubians, and the technologically advanced Asiatics. Send out your scouts, position your soldiers on the borders of your kingdom, build lookout posts, and start construction of vital catapults. Let the battle commence. Features thousands of faithful, superbly animated subjects. Over 30 different professional groups with 6 different soldier grades. 4 different races with very different characteristics. A huge variety of landscapes from lava and ice to swamps and thick forests. Multiplayer mode for 2 players and up to 6 various computer opponents. Online help and a Windows-oriented user interface. Create your own worlds with the easy-to-use map editor. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box with some captions, and I've got to say, yep, this box sells me on the game. It makes the game sound really unique, really complex, and honestly just the overall design of the back of the box with kind of a map in the background and the screenshots to make the game look really good. This totally sells me. This feels, and this is going to sound weird, this feels like the kind of box that when you pick it up is going to be heavy because there's like a massive manual inside of it. This feels substantial to me. It feels important to me. And I know that's kind of a weird thing to say, but that's what the back of the box makes me feel like. So yes, if I had seen this on the store shelf and I was more into real-time strategy games, I would have picked this up. Now, whether I played it all the way through to completion or not, that's another question. But I definitely would have bought this because I would have thought, this is going to look great on my shelf. It feels significant. The back of the box for the Settlers 2 definitely sells me on the title. Anyway, we're going to move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The bottom line is that the graphics look great. This features very well designed pixel art styled graphics. All of the buildings and environments look distinct and are nicely detailed. I honestly have no real complaints about the game visually. The graphics are charming, and the overall visual design is very well done. Animations, meanwhile, are all high quality too, which given the relative resolution and fidelity of the graphics is a feat in and of itself. I am always impressed when small pixel representations of characters and worlds can have a distinct personality, and I believe there is a true art to making pixel art feel meaningful. The Settlers 2 has a lot of charm, and I think the graphics, the animations, and the overall visual environment of the game do a ton to make the whole experience feel engaging and visually stimulating, despite the overall pace of the game's gameplay. Moving on to the sound and music, the music here was solid. Now, you do have a choice of either MIDI synthesized tracks or CD-based audio, which was effectively digitally rendered MIDI files using high-quality synthesized samples, and they all sounded good. No real complaints here, though if I were to nitpick, I would argue that the mix between the sound effects and the music was really off, forcing me to reset it every time I loaded my game. I like the sounds of birds chirping as much as the next guy, but in the Settlers 2, That chirping was extremely loud, especially in comparison to the music. It's easy enough to reset the balance, but still something I noticed. Otherwise, I thought the auditory environment of the game was high quality and showed a good deal of care and attention to detail. Definitely a job well done by the game's audio team. Moving on to the narrative and story, in The Settlers 2, you take control of a displaced Roman legion who finds themselves in a series of unfamiliar lands, needing to both create a settlement to preserve their civilization while at the same time seeking out a number of special gates, one for each campaign mission, that signifies the end of a given mission and allows your civilization to effectively warp to a new set of lands with all new conditions for survival and victory. If you can guide your people to victory across 10 different campaign maps, you may be able to return home. If not, your civilization will likely be lost to time. Are you strategic enough to lead your civilization home? There's only one way to find out. The story here, while not a major part of the overall gameplay experience, mostly worked for me, with just enough motivation provided to make you want to keep playing the game, and hopefully surviving from one mission to the next. While the story wasn't front and center, I did appreciate the little story interjections that happened as you play an individual mission, which, while mostly specific to your current situation and mission, did help to increase my overall immersion in the game world, and made me care just a little bit more about the fate of my civilization. I would never claim that The Settlers 2 was a narrative-driven experience, but it didn't need to be, and the story that was here worked just fine. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we already talked extensively, and I mean extensively, about the gameplay and controls for the game, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I will say is that the mouse-driven interface is mostly effective at allowing you to interact with the game, while the menu-driven system of defining your preferences and overall direction for your civilization was interesting, but ultimately made me feel a bit too disconnected from the act of playing the game, at least based on my own personal preferences. I've gone on record before as saying that needing to try to micromanage your units in a competitive real-time strategy game against a computer-controlled opponent can often be frustrating, because the computer will outplay you and out-micromanage you, which can make it hard for more casual real-time strategy gamers to make progress in certain games. The Settlers 2 has the exact opposite problem, in that there's no direct unit control at all in the game, though interestingly, that doesn't totally remove the need to micromanage. It just makes it so that you're micromanaging menus and sliders rather than units and resources. The degree of micromanagement in The Settlers 2 is less than most real-time strategy games, which I appreciated, though at the end of the day, I thought that the complete lack of control over individual resources really did affect my feeling of player agency while I played the game, and honestly, I'm not so sure I preferred this more hands-off experience. I'm sure there's a happy medium that could have been reached, but The Settlers 2 certainly was not it. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a bad game. I'm simply saying that I spent more time feeling like I had no control as opposed to feeling in control, which was a very odd thing to wrap my head around. I did eventually get there, but even after well over 40 hours of gameplay, I can't say that it ever felt truly natural. Despite that general game design paradigm though, I do have to say that the complexity built into the experience ended up being something I really enjoyed. And I think if a game with the depth and complexity of The Settlers 2 allowed for a bit more direct control of resources and units, this might have been one of my favorite real-time strategy games of all time. As it stands though, there were a couple of areas that I felt were just a bit too different to really make me love it. Don't get me wrong, The Settlers 2 is a good game. It's just also a game that requires a very specific thought process to play, and speaking from personal experience, it definitely took some time to get used to. So, what is our verdict on The Settlers 2? Well, The Settlers 2 is an incredibly well-designed game with tons of detailed and complex mechanics and interactions, marred slightly by the slow default game speed, and then made even more frustrating by the almost complete lack of player agency that made it so that you became more of a passive observer as opposed to an active and positive force, as each campaign mission continued to play on. This style of gameplay, while definitely interesting, made me miss the more traditional unit-based control of many real-time strategy titles, which is a feeling I did not expect to have, because as I've spoken about previously, real-time strategy games don't tend to click with me, at least right away. The Settlers 2 is another example of a real-time strategy game that I appreciated, but ultimately failed to truly love. Though admittedly, there is a ton to like about the game, and I totally understand why many people consider The Settlers 2 to be a phenomenal, unique gaming experience. I, however, don't have quite that same level of praise for the title, which is why The Settlers 2 has ultimately just become the newest member in our collection of golden oldies. If you play the game, you'll almost certainly have a good time, once you figure out some of the game's underlying complexity and mechanics. But based on my own experiences, at least playing the campaign mission, I think there are some frustrations and rough points that prevent the game from being a truly stellar real-time strategy experience. Despite that, The Settlers 2 is a good game, and I have no reservations with affirming that The Settlers 2 is certainly deserving of its spot in our list of golden oldies. It is now time to talk about this week's gaming challenges, which are all, of course, focused on The Settlers 2. Your first challenge, worth 1 coin, is to place 5 buildings on a settlement. This one is pretty darn easy. You just have to place 5 buildings and construct them on whatever settlement or mission you want. If you can do that, you will earn 1 coin. Your second challenge is to complete your first campaign mission. There is a 10-mission campaign built into the game. If you can complete your first mission, you will earn 2 coins. And then finally, your third challenge, worth 3 coins, is to make your way to the 5th campaign mission. If you can reach the 5th campaign mission, you don't have to beat it. If you can get to the 5th campaign mission, you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on The Settlers 2. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Little Big Adventure 2. So definitely write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. Though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Little Big Adventure 2. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.